Kevin.
Well, good morning. It's so good to be back with you here at Westminster Bible Chapel. Over the many years, I think it's about 30 years that I have been coming to WBC. I've always enjoyed your warmth and your fellowship and your love for God's Word. I believe it has been 8 years. It was Easter of 2015 since I was here with you. So it really is good to be back with you this Sunday. Before I begin my message, I did want to give a huge thank you to Westminster Bible Chapel. It was Tuesday, May 22nd of 2018, and that was a very dark day for Brenda and I. In the early afternoon, you would have found Brenda and myself on the sidewalk just outside of Royal Columbian, and we were weeping. I had just seen a neurosurgeon who told me that I had a huge cancerous growth inside my spine. He said in his opinion it was likely malignant. He said it had likely metastasized. And then he said this, he said in his medical terminology, "Your spine is gone." Those were his words. What he meant was the cancer had taken out a big chunk of my L4 vertebrae. The neurosurgeon basically said, "There's nothing we can do, go home." And what Brenda and I heard was, "Go home and set your house in order." 2 days later, in excruciating pain, I landed in the ER in Abbotsford, and I began a very long journey. Because of the fear that the tumor would cut off the blood and the nerves to my legs, I was immediately and completely immobilized. I wasn't even allowed to turn over for quite a number of weeks, given massive doses of steroids to try to bring down the growth and the swelling. Had every imaginable scan, MRI, CT, PET scans, bone marrow biopsies, and very heavy radiation therapy, which was a bit of a trick when you're completely and utterly immobilized. Eventually, had to be in a body brace for many months. And during those dark days, I'll call them that, of 2018 and 2019, I was just so deeply thankful for the prayers of God's people. And I communicated often with Duncan. And Duncan told me, emailed me, that Westminster Bible Chapel was praying for me at that time. And so this is the first chance I've had to do it. I just wanted to say that I am deeply grateful. And for your encouragement, well, I can't play hockey anymore. I walk my 10,000 steps every day. I'm fully back at work. I play golf again. In fact, one checkup, doctor looked at me and he said, "Kevin, you are just our best case scenario." And then he said something like this. He said, "Kevin, I think you had someone on your side." I didn't say this to him. I wish I had. I wish I had said to him, "Well, God answers prayer." And I just want to thank you this morning for your prayers during those dark years in our life. So, my thanks. The title over our message this morning is Faith in Action, a Hebrews 11 case study. It is some time, maybe 8 years, since I've had the privilege of chatting with some of you. And if you were to ask me, "Kevin, what's new in your life? What has happened over the last 8 years?" I have a very easy answer. Just one word would be my answer: grandchildren. Grandchildren. I now have 5 wonderful grandchildren, 4 girls, 1 boy, 10, 8, 6, 4, and 1, and it is truly a joy. But the reason I tell you this, let's just suppose you and I were talking and I mentioned grandchildren, and then you asked me, Kevin, do you love your grandchildren? Well, I would answer, well, yes, of course, I love my grandchildren. But suppose I said that, but I never spent time with them. I never played with them. I never read them stories. I never talked to them on the phone. I forgot their birthdays, and I never prayed for them. I think you would quickly say, Kevin, do you really love them? You see, true love is something that we just naturally expect will be demonstrated. We just naturally anticipate that love will be put into action. Without action, we have to question whether the love is real at all. Recently, we had a series in my home church on Hebrews 11. I've always loved that chapter, but I kind of fell in love with it again. And as I read and reread this great faith chapter, it became apparent to me that faith is exactly the same as love. Faith is something that we just naturally expect will be demonstrated. True faith is something that will result in action. Without action, we have to question, is the faith real at all? And this is our topic for this morning. Faith in action, a Hebrews 11 case study. We're going to read a number of verses from Hebrews 11. They are on the PowerPoint, so you can either follow, as I always love to do. I like to follow actually in God's Word, but if you'd prefer to follow on the PowerPoint, please do. So we're reading starting at verse 1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, he still speaks, even though he is dead. Let's go to verse 7. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And now let's jump down to verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. And I trust God will bless the reading of these selected verses from Hebrews 11. Now, as I begin, I'm going to take a little bit of a risk, and I am going to read a paragraph from someone who died over 50 years ago. And the risk is that some might say, if you're reading from or quoting an author who died 50 years ago, that you're not current, you're not contemporary. In the university world where I live, they might say that you're a dinosaur if you're quoting people who died 50 years ago. Well, I love A.W. Tozer. I've always loved his books. And so I'm going to take the risk, and I'm going to read from A.W. Tozer this morning, from a book called Treasury of Tozer, and the chapter is True Faith Brings Commitment. Let me read you what he says. Millions of professed believers talk as if he were real and act as if he were not. And always our actual position is to be discovered by the way we act, not by the way we talk. We can prove our faith by our commitment to it and in no other way. Any belief that does not command the one who holds it is not a real belief. It is a pseudo-belief only. And it might shock some of us profoundly if we were brought suddenly face to face with our beliefs and actually forced to test them in the fires of practical living. Those are the words of A.W. Tozer. And I wonder if Tozer didn't have Hebrews 11 in mind when he wrote that paragraph. Because Hebrews 11 is all about faith in action, living out our faith. In verse 4, we discover that Abel, son of Adam and Eve, that first family, we're told that he was a man of faith. But it doesn't stop there. We're told that he had faith and he lived it out by bringing a better sacrifice to God. In verse 7, we discover that Noah had faith. Does it stop there? Are we simply told that Noah was a man of faith? No. We're told that Noah had faith and he lived it out. When he was warned about coming judgment, he built an ark as God had directed. In verse 8, we find that Abraham had faith. Does it stop there? Are we simply told that Abraham was a man of faith? No. We read that Abraham had faith and he lived it out. When he was called to go to a new land, he willingly went, even though he didn't know where he was going. In verse 21, we read of Jacob being a man of faith, and he put his faith into action. When he was dying, he blessed Joseph's sons, recognizing the future blessing that was going to come through them. Verse 22, we're told that Joseph was a man of faith. Does it stop there? No, he was a man of faith and he put it into action. Even at the end of his life, he reminded his sons that one day Israel was going to leave Egypt, and he gave instructions on how his bones should be taken with the people. Faith in action. Now, before I go any further, I do want to be very clear. I don't want to be misunderstood this morning. I am absolutely not talking about works somehow, or actions, our actions, somehow being needed for salvation. We all know the great verse in Ephesians 2. By grace, you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. But if you are a Christian this morning, if you are a true believer in Jesus, then God's desire is that our faith would be lived out, that our faith would be put into action. Real faith, true faith, as indicated in Hebrews 11, is something that we would just expect to be demonstrated, to be lived out. This morning, we're going to settle in on verses 23 to 29. And using just one of the great people of faith from Hebrews 11, Moses, we're going to learn together 4 lessons about faith in action. So if you're ready, let's go. Lesson number 1. Faith in action overcomes fear. Verse 23 takes us back to Exodus 1. And I think we all know the story. Because of Joseph, the Israelites were living in Egypt. They had grown to become a great people, a large number. And Pharaoh was worried. If there was war, what if the Israelites joined the enemy, and then you would have an enemy from within? And Pharaoh comes up with a plan. He says, we'll put the Israelites under extreme labor. Make them build treasure cities. Treat them ruthlessly. And we hope that they will not prosper. But as we know, the strategy fails. And the Israelites continue to prosper and they multiply. Pharaoh then goes to strategy number 2. And he gives an awful order. He passes a law, so to speak, that if an Israelite boy is born, he must be immediately killed, thrown into the river. Pharaoh was the most powerful man on earth. To defy his order, to defy his law, would mean extreme punishment, likely death. And here are Moses' parents, and they give birth to a baby Moses. I can only imagine the challenge of that moment for them. On one hand, you have the law, Pharaoh's order. That baby, Moses, needs to be thrown into the river. To defy that order, to defy that law, would likely mean extreme punishment for their entire family. But on the other hand, to throw Moses in the river would defy the God that they loved. And Moses' parents, they decide to trust God and defy the order of Pharaoh. And as you know, they hide Moses. There was something I really want you to notice from verse 23 about Moses' parents. We read in verse 23, they were not afraid. They were not afraid. Those are remarkable words considering the context, considering the power of Pharaoh. They were not afraid. Moses' parents put their faith in action by overcoming fear and taking a risk for God. Interesting, in verse 27, the same thing is said of Moses as his parents. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. Moses, like his parents before him, lived out his faith by trusting God and overcoming fear. I did a little research before coming to speak. Research on our phobias, our fears. Do you know what the top 3 fears that people have are? The top 3 phobias? Well, here they are. Number 3 is aerophobia, the fear of flying. Many people really don't like to get on planes, and they have a fear of flying. That is number 3, according to the research I was looking at. Number 2, sociophobia, which is the fear of having to talk to other people. Some people, that just makes them really anxious when they have to talk to other people, and especially if they have to talk publicly. But number one, you know what the number one fear is? The number one phobia, if I could call it that people have? It is arachnophobia. It is the fear of spiders. Number one on the list, fear of spiders. I don't know, I can see some people nodding. Apparently, 16% of people have a very serious anxiety or fear about spiders. Now, fear is something that we might kind of chuckle at. We kind of chuckle at the fear of spiders. But in our spiritual lives, fear can actually be debilitating. Fear can limit our ability to be missional. I can't teach a Sunday school class. I'm afraid. I can't teach a Bible study group. I'm afraid. I can't speak to my neighbor about Jesus. I am afraid. I can't have people into my home and show hospitality. I'm afraid. A few years ago, I attended a conference, and one of the speakers at this conference, he talked about a survey that had been done of elderly people. And in this survey, these more elderly people were asked, are there 3 things that you would do differently if you could live life over again? 3 things that you would do differently if you could live life over again. Some said they would take more time to reflect. Rather than just kind of rushing through life, they would take more time to reflect. Some said, and I like this one, they would focus more on things that would live on after they die. But here was number 3. This was the third thing that this group of more elderly people said, that if they could live life over again, they would take more risks for God. They would take more risks for God, or maybe I should put it, they would take more risks with God. In Joshua 1, Moses had now passed away, and Joshua realizes that he has the burden of leading Israel at an incredibly challenging time. And no doubt Joshua was feeling overwhelmed by the task ahead of him. And in verse 9 of Joshua 1, God speaks to Joshua, and he says, Joshua, be strong and be courageous. And then God says to Joshua, do not be afraid. Some versions actually put it this way, and I kind of like this. Do not be terrified. Don't be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Joshua, set fear aside. Trust me. Take risks with me. I think the writer of Hebrews sums this up very well in chapter 13 and verse 6. We can say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? And the writer of Hebrews is saying, set fear aside. Trust the Lord, our helper. Take risks for God. Moses' parents and then Moses himself, they had faith in action. They weren't paralyzed by fear. They were willing to take risks for God. And my challenge for us here this morning at Westminster Bible Chapel is be a people who put faith in action, who are willing to take risks with God. Number 2, lesson number 2. Putting faith into action has a cost. Perhaps One of the all-time favorite Sunday school stories is how Moses was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter and how he is eventually adopted and he becomes the grandson of Pharaoh. Moses, in Exodus 2, he had it made. He had education. He had influence. He had enormous wealth. He had power. By most analysis, the richest person in the world today is Elon Musk, with his Tesla and Twitter and SpaceX holdings. He has a net worth of approximately $220 billion. It's hard to even kind of wrap your mind around that. I feel so sad for Bill Gates. For many years, he was the richest person in the world, but he's now fallen to number 6 with a paltry net worth of only $115 billion. Poor Bill Gates. Moses, in some ways, was ahead of Elon Musk or Bill Gates, because in addition to great power or great wealth, as grandson of Pharaoh, he would have had immense influence, immense power. But you know the story. In the second half of Exodus 2, Moses, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and his heart went out to his Hebrew brother, and he made a choice. Moses intervened on behalf of the Israelite, and in the struggle, the Egyptian was killed. And when Pharaoh finds out, he wants to kill his grandson, his adopted grandson. And Moses is forced to flee, and he goes and lives in the desert with nothing. All his power, all his influence, all his wealth, gone. To use maybe a modern analogy, Moses went from being Elon Musk to living under the Granville Street Bridge in just a few minutes. And Moses was willing to pay the cost. Listen again to verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Moses said, living out my faith, putting my faith in action is more important to me than all the treasures of Egypt. Moses was willing to pay a heavy, heavy cost to put his faith into action. As I was preparing last night to speak today, I did some introspection. Speakers should always do that as they're preparing to speak. And I had to ask myself, Kevin, how far would you go to put your faith into action? Last week, I had an anniversary, not wedding anniversary, but I had my 30th anniversary being on the faculty of Trinity Western University. 30 years. Over 30 years, I've taught a lot of students. And the sad thing is, you don't remember them all. Sometimes that can lead you into some embarrassing moments. I was in Milestones in Langley, and I was just finishing. I got up from the table, and all of a sudden, somebody got up from another table, and the next thing I knew, this person was giving me an enormous bear hug, very close bear hug, and I didn't know who they were. What do you do when someone is bear hugging you and you don't know who they are? Well, I just kind of played along, and I said, oh, so good to see you again, too. And then after a while, I said, can I have your business card? I want to stay connected. And he gave me his business card. Oh, okay, now I know who you are. Well, it's hard to remember the thousands of students, but a few very much stand out in my mind. And there's one student that just kind of rises above for me. As he took my law classes, he kind of fell in love with law. He wrote his LSAT exam. He was accepted into a very good law school in the United States. When he graduated, he had an offer to clerk with the U.S. court. He then was hired by a very prestigious Seattle law firm, and he had a brilliant law career ahead of him. But God asked him to do something different. After just a few years at the law firm, God asked him to join the International Justice Mission and go to Thailand and work to see women delivered from the sex trade in Thailand. And so he put his faith in action, and he left a very lucrative Seattle law practice to go to Thailand for that purpose. To me, that is faith in action. Now, God doesn't call all of us to go to Thailand, of course, but he does ask every one of us to put our faith into action. And sometimes there is a cost. We need to be willing, as Moses was, to pay the cost. Number 3, lesson number 3. Faith in action looks forward. Have you ever wondered how Moses persevered through those long, lonely years in the desert? In Exodus 2, Moses finds himself a long ways away from the action, far away from where Israel is suffering under Pharaoh. He finds himself in the backside of the desert, and he's looking after his father-in-law's sheep. They're not even his own sheep. Here he is in his prime years, strong, well-educated, the perfect leader for Israel, and instead of leading the people, he's in the backside of the desert, looking after sheep that aren't even his own. And as 1 year became 2, and 2 became 5, and 5 years turned to 10, and 10 years became 20, and 20 years turned to 40. I am sure that at times there was deep discouragement as Moses would think, God's never going to use me. Maybe I should just give my faith up. It seems like I'm going nowhere. How did Moses persevere? How did he keep going for those 40 years in the desert? Have you ever wondered how Moses persevered through all the plagues? In Exodus 7, Moses comes for the first time to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh refuses. And so there is the plague of blood. The rivers and the streams and the lakes and the ponds turn to blood. And I'm sure that Moses, there would have been some excitement after that, thinking, well, now for sure Pharaoh's going to let the Israelites go. Only to have Pharaoh harden his heart and say, no. And as we read through Exodus 7, 8, 9, 10, over and over, Moses comes, let my people go. And Pharaoh refuses, and another plague falls over Egypt. And no doubt every single time Moses thought, this is it. We're going to be released. And again, Pharaoh hardens his heart and refuses, and it must have been discouraging for Moses. Just think of the 8th plague. Locusts covered the entire country of Egypt. The ground was black, we're told, from locusts. In fact, we're told that there were so many that there was nothing green left on a single tree or plant in all of Egypt. And I am sure that Moses would have thought, well, this is it. Finally, Pharaoh is going to let us go, only have Pharaoh to yet again harden his heart. And that must have been incredibly disappointing to Moses. 8 times now there had been these plagues, and 8 times Pharaoh had said no. You know, I think for myself, I might have made it through two or 3, and then I would have given up. But Moses, he kept going through the 9th and to the 10th plague. Why? How did he do it? How did he persevere through 40 years in the desert, through 10 plagues? How did he keep moving? Well, I think the answer, verse 26, he was looking ahead to his reward. When I'm lecturing, sometimes I'll have a PowerPoint, and I'll say to my students, I'll say, there's one word on that PowerPoint that I want you to circle, star, highlight. That word is the key word for us today. Well, the word ahead is the word I would like you to star, circle, highlight. I believe that word is critical for us. As he was putting his faith into action, Moses was looking ahead. He's looking forward. A few years ago, in our law firm, senior partner phoned me on a Friday. He said, "Can you run up to my office?" So I went up, and I came in, and he said, "Kevin," he said, you're going to run for me tomorrow." Well, you never say no to a senior partner. So I said, "Okay, sure, I'll run for you tomorrow." And then I thought, okay, well, where am I going to run? And so he began to tell me how he had signed up for the 24-hour relay at Swangard Stadium to raise money for charity. And he said, "I've raised a lot of money, but I am not going to run. You're going to run." So the next day, I found myself at Swangard Stadium. And I thought this was going to be kind of relaxed, but I discovered that our team, about 10 lawyers from our firm, were incredibly competitive. And immediately they were all talking about their times and how we were going to be the best team. And when my first time came to run, over 24 hours, you ran about 5 times. My first time to run, I was really feeling the pressure. And so I wanted to show I was part of this team, and I was going to have a great time. And so I took off running, and you did one loop of the stadium, and then you headed out on Boundary. And so I was just going for it, running down Boundary. And I turned onto 49th. And all of a sudden, my legs they started to feel like jelly. And my breath, could barely get a breath. And because I hadn't trained at all. And so I began to think, this is awful. I'm just going to have to stop. I'm going to have to walk. Maybe I won't even be able to get back to the stadium. This is incredibly embarrassing. This is probably the end of my legal career. And as I approached the corner of 49th and Patterson, the organizers of this event, they had some volunteers with some tables, and they gave you water as you were running by. So one of the volunteers, this man, he reached out to give me a glass of water. And then he said something to me. He said, "Keep looking forward. Keep looking forward." And he pointed down Patterson. He said, "The entrance to the stadium is just right there." You see, I think he recognized that I was in some trouble. And so he said, just keep going. Keep looking forward. He said, you can do it. And that gave me kind of a second wind. It gave me some new energy. Just keep looking for the entrance to the stadium. Well, I believe Moses was able to make the choices he did to persevere through those incredible challenges because he was looking ahead. He was looking forward. Moses wasn't focused on his current situation, but rather he was focused on the tremendous future he had ahead with his great God. 1 Peter 1:4 says we have an inheritance, incorruptible and undefiled, that fades not away, reserved in heaven for you. We have a future ahead, an eternity with Jesus in a place where righteousness will prevail, where there are no wildfires, there is no war, there's no sickness, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there's no tears. As a child of God, I have a future ahead with Christ that is beyond anything that I could imagine. And faith in action, real living faith says, I'm going to keep my eye forward on that future. Rather than focusing on the challenges of today, as hard as those challenges may be, I will keep my eyes ahead. My challenge for us here at WBC this morning, as we live out our faith, as we put our faith into action, let's keep our eyes looking ahead to the tremendous future we have with our Lord. Last lesson. Faith in action means trusting even in the tough times. Our final lesson from this great man of faith, Moses, comes from verse 29. Simple verse. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea. As I read my Bible, not sure if you do this, there's certain scenes in the Bible where I really wish I could have been there. I would have loved to have been at the Jericho walls. Wouldn't that have been cool to actually see the walls of Jericho tumbling down? That would have been amazing. I would have loved to have seen David take on Goliath. That would have been a very special day. I would have loved to have been on the Sermon on the Mount, to actually hear the Lord give the Sermon on the Mount. But verse 29 is also one of the scenes that I desperately would have loved to have been at. Moses, after the 10th plague, is finally told by Pharaoh, go. And Moses leads perhaps 2 million people. We know from Exodus 12:37 that there were 600,000 men. There were probably a greater number of women plus children, so maybe 2 million people. In chapter 14, we have the account of how Pharaoh changes his mind and he regrets the lost slave labor from those 2 million people. And so he reverses his decision, and Pharaoh gathers his vast army and he pursues after the Israelites. His army included 600 of the best, the most modern chariots of the day. And against that mighty modern army, Moses and the Israelites would seem to have no chance. To make matters worse, the Red Sea was in front of them, and there were sort of mountains on either side. One geographer describes where they were as a geographic cul-de-sac. They were trapped, and they could see the dust of the mighty Egyptian army rapidly approaching. Moses, do you have faith now? Do you have faith now? If we were to read Exodus 14:13, we see that in that very tough moment, difficult moment, that Moses had faith in action. He demonstrated his faith. He tells the people, don't be afraid, stand firm. Even at the toughest of times, Moses trusted his great God. And of course, you know the result. The Red Sea parts and the Israelites cross, and when Pharaoh tries to follow, the water rushes in and the mighty Egyptian army is destroyed. I believe sometimes preachers make a mistake when they present the gospel. Sometimes the message is that if you come to Jesus, you'll have sort of the perfect life. God never promises that. He never promises that life will be easy, but he does promise he'll never abandon us. He does say, I will be there even at the Red Sea. Even in the Red Sea moments, you can trust me. Faith in action says, Lord, I'm going to trust you, even at the Red Sea. Folks, I know that many of us will have health challenges, maybe work challenges, family difficulty, financial challenge. And I know those challenges are real and very painful. I'll never forget the day back in July of 2018 when I was able to get out of bed and I could not walk. I couldn't take one step. I remember the fear, the anxiety, It's a great verse. Thank you. It's a wonderful verse. I remember the fear and the anxiety from that moment. The pain was very real. Friends, I know that life's challenges can be immense. But we do have a great God. And he loves us beyond measure. He wants us to know that he is there, even at the Red Sea moments of life. And his desire is that we would put our faith in action, that we would live out our faith by trusting him even in those tough moments of life. verse was just passed up to me. Incredible verse. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. As I close, my prayer for the week ahead for all of us is that we would be a people who not just have faith, but a people who have faith in action, a people who will take risks for God or with God, a people who understand that faith does have a cost, a people who will keep their eyes ahead, looking at the amazing future we have with Christ, and finally, a people who will trust even at the Red Sea. So good being with you again. Thank you so much.